Ladies and gentlemen, boom, 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 boom. Please welcome, boom, 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 Kersten, boom, 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 boom. What's
Howdy, folks. Today we're talking about what happens when the light doesn't play nice. Low light, unpredictable conditions, technical compromises, and how some of the most powerful images are made because the light is working against you. Right after this. Welcome to Camera Shake, the show where we bring you the insider scoop on all things photography and videography, giving you a unique opportunity to stay ahead of the curve. We've spent literally hundreds of hours interviewing some of the most respected photographers of our time and on our planet, giving you access to real-world knowledge and expertise you won't find anywhere else. As always, I'm your host, Kersten, and if you enjoy free podcasts and YouTube content like this, there are a couple of easy ways you can support the show. You can grab yourself some official Camera Shake merch over on our store. Hoodies, tees, mugs, the whole lot. Or if you're feeling extra generous, you can buy us a coffee over at buymeacoffee.com/Camera Shake to help us keep creating more episodes like this one. Absolutely no pressure though, but your support generally makes a difference. Right, so without further ado, I'm really excited about today's conversation. Today's guest is the concept photographer, host of the Behind the Shot podcast, and one of my best friends on this planet. Give it up for Mr. Steve BRAZILL. Steve, man, welcome to the show. How's it going?
Good. I'm doing wonderful. Howdy, howdy, howdy. How are you, my friend?
I'm good. I have survived Nashville, which is always good news.
Yeah, actually, we had... I just did a family video of our trip. We had a blast in Nashville with you and with Kevin and with Mark and with David Bergman. And I had an Insta360 with me for the trip. After Nashville, we drove down to New Orleans. And I just finished editing like a 2-minute family video of the footage. And one of the pictures was the overhead that David took, the selfie of all of us at the dinner table. And it just brought back such good memories.
Yeah, it's so much fun. I mean, any of these events are fantastic. The imaging is one of the highlights of my year, actually. And it's not, it's not because it's an amazing expo, which it is, but it's really because I have an opportunity to meet a lot of my friends like yourself, and it's really, to me, it's all about the people, and of course, it's about the ability to exchange thoughts and ask people for advice and things like that, and just get into those conversations that are just difficult to have on a day-to-day basis. I mean, I'm saying this, on this podcast, I have these conversations every week, really, But I think that's the important thing about things like Imaging USA.
There is something that just crossed my mind, and that is, if somebody watching this if you haven't been to Imaging USA or any of the conferences, right? They used to do Photo Expo Plus. I don't think they do now. The photography show in the UK, WPPI that happens every year in Vegas. Imaging USA moves around to different locations each time. If you haven't been, so what crossed my mind as you were saying that is, sometimes I think people like me forget and don't pay enough attention to the fact that it is an educational thing, right? It is designed with sessions and pre-conference workshops that you can pay for, or sessions that you can go into a conference room and listen to some, hopefully great educator teach you lighting or headshots or wedding photography or managing your photography, lots of educational opportunity. However, I always feel like I'm dictating to my phone now. I always want to say, however, the one thing to me is exactly what you just said. These people that I know, and I may speak to like this over Zoom or whatever all the time, being able to, at the end of a day, go to the hotel bar and sit down with friends and give them a hug when you see them. And they bring people with them to the dinner that you don't know, right? And you meet them. And that right there is why I go to these. And I think every photographer should go to these. Don't say to yourself, I don't need to go learn photography. Or in what I do, I don't need networking. It's not an issue of a need. the community that we have is kind of special. And everybody at those conferences, you immediately have a connection with. You like photography.
Absolutely. It's exactly this. I always say this, like, the most important part of any of these things is not really what happens on the expo floor. It's actually what happens afterwards in the hotel bar.
Yeah.
Or over dinner. You just have a random conversation, and like, you and me, we do this all the time. We'll talk about something. It's like, oh yeah, this happened to me the other day on this shoot. And then, you might go, oh yeah, have you tried this? And you go, oh, well, yeah, that's a good idea. It's really a lot of things that I have learned really as a photographer. I have learned through conversations with other photographers. That's, that's super important. Now we're going to talk about low light photography. So let's get right into that. Now,
okay, before you do, I have to throw two things in.
Okay.
One, when you're at a conference, one of my favorite things is day trips. So because I don't tend to do the sessions, I've done some when I'm reviewing it for my podcast, but because I don't attend a lot of the sessions, I tend to sleep in late. I'll go in late. I'll walk the expo floor in circles. I'll walk every aisle a couple of times. 2-3 hours I'll spend on the expo floor running into friends, making plans for later that day. Or in the case of what we did, we'll jump in a car and we'll drive down to downtown Nashville because the expo was on the outskirts of Nashville, and walk around, Broadway in Nashville is absolutely a blast. And again, that's one of the reasons to go. But the other thing is, you record your intros before we do the show. And for all I know, you could end up re-recording it later. That's fine. You said something during the recording of your intro that I think we won't talk about it because it's in the intro, but I think it's absolutely one of the most important recognitions I've heard in relation to today's topic. And that is, you kind of ended the intro with some, and I'm going to paraphrase here, so don't beat me up if I don't get it exact. And why or how some of the best images are made because the lighting was bad. I think that is a critical thing for people to say over in their head a couple of times. It's not in spite of the lighting being bad. Like it's such a minor distinction, but it's not in spite of bad lighting. I managed to create art, right? Often you create art specifically because of the bad light, because you were challenged by the bad light, because you had to overcome the issues of the bad light. The bad light in and of itself is a creator with you if you choose to use it that way.
Absolutely. And that's a super important point. Now, when you first start out in photography, bad light can really break you because you simply don't know how to deal with it. And you're sort of, if you do get a good shot under bad lighting conditions, especially in the beginning, those are, what's it called? Like almost like lucky mistakes. You just end up with a shot that's actually pretty cool. You didn't plan it. It wasn't like a thing that you could foresee. You can control it. It just happened.
Intentional accident.
Yeah, intentional accident. That's exactly it. When you talk to people like yourself or Joe McNally, or people who've basically seen everything, every lighting situation under the sun, and just instinctively know how to react. That's an interesting thing. It's a little bit like
you just lump me in with Joe McNally.
Oh, when
I'm about to dance. Yeah, no. Yeah, please God, no. That man is arguably the greatest, in my opinion, the greatest lighting person on the planet in a generation.
Absolutely. And the one thing I've learned, like, in my years in photography, is that dealing with bad lighting situations, I say bad lighting and low light conditions can be part of bad lighting, but bad lighting could be anything. It could be terrible colored light. There's all sorts of different bad lighting situations.
In my world, it's not a single light. Yes. In my world, you may have blue light, you may have red light, whatever combination of colors you have, when they combine on a person's skin and make them look putrid, right? Bad lighting is not necessarily I'm shooting in the dark.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like improvisation in music. You start out creating a guitar solo, let's say, you start out improvising, and then things can go awry a little bit. But what you do when you improvise is you surf that wave. You just follow the stream and you just react to what, the music throws at you. And sometimes you can get yourself in a bind, but you follow that idea and then you end up somewhere where you just go, oh, I don't know how to get up. But this is the interesting thing about it, and photography I've learned, in my world is it's a little bit like that. You basically deal with what the world throws at you and you ride that wave and you basically try and control it as much as you can, so I'm not sure whether there really is a bad lighting situation per se. There are just lots of different lighting situations. Some are easier to handle, some are harder to handle, but it's just what you make of it. Okay. But for the average photographer, low light situations are probably some of the hardest to deal with. So when you first walk into a venue, right? And as a concert photographer, I know this too. Sometimes you walk into a venue and it's beautifully lit and you think, oh, this is cool. And then sometimes you walk into a place and you go, what the hell? Over here in the UK, it's usually like small bars or pubs, where the lighting is terrible. Sometimes there's, it's terrible colors, underlit, like what's the first thought that goes through your mind when you walk into a place and the lighting is awful?
Wow. That could be such a long conversation in and of itself. So it's an interesting question, and let me explain why. If you're smart when you're doing concert photography, you're going to research bands that you've not shot before, or even if you have shot them before, every tour changes lighting wise, and you get a feel for kind of what that band is into. There are times that I go into a venue, however, that it's always, lit up a certain way while people are coming in. But a lot of times on any given individual tour, like I shot a show the other night, was 4 bands. The first band was ridiculously dark. Just the whole show was ridiculously dark. Second band was lit really, really well. I'm like, okay, cool. Now we're getting somewhere. They're going to do better lighting as we go. The third band was both. There were moments of extreme darkness. Then they would throw landing lights that were on the stage next to the drummer behind the front line, behind them, that were almost going off like strobes. And then the headliner came out and it was 3-4 stops brighter than any of the other bands. So when I walk into what I shoot, which is music and also some fight sports, I always go for my shutter speed first. What is it I want to do, right? If it's James Taylor sitting on a stool singing with a guitar, I can shoot that at 100th of a second if I want. I can go slower if I want a little bit of motion in him, right? It's an artistic choice at that point, but I don't need 400th of a second, okay? On the other hand, when I'm shooting a band called Nothing More the other night, where the lead singer, Johnny Hawkins, is in front of you for half a second and never stops moving and uses the whole stage. That's not true. He actually sat down on one of the risers for a moment, and it just made for some beautiful photos, that kind of in between moment. But the point holds. When you're shooting a metal band or a rock band with hair flying and people jumping in the air, I might say to myself, you know what, I can probably shoot him at 3/20th of a second, but I know this guy's gonna launch off this riser, and I don't know that I'll be in the right position for one of them, but probably not for the rest of them. And I want to get one that's nice and sharp. I might want 500th of a second. From that, all the other decisions for me are made. So based on the show I'm going into, the show the other night, 4 bands, mostly rock and metal, I'll set my shutter to 1/400th of a second, or maybe 1/500th, but usually I'll start 3/20th to 500th, somewhere in there. And so let's call it 1/400th of a second. I'm always wide open. My lenses are 2.8. If I'm in a scenario where I have enough light and I want to do artistic, effects on the lighting by raising my aperture, maybe I'll do that. I mean, if I want to shoot at f11 to starburst a light, okay. That almost never happens for me, though. I'm not shooting stadium shows where I've got plenty of light. So I'm almost always at 2.8. I set my shutter based on the subject. My ISO is whatever I need. I don't care. If I have to shoot a show at 500th of a second, I'm going to go nuts. If I have to shoot a show, this would never happen. But if I have to shoot a show at 1,000th of a second because this person launches out of a cannon over the audience and I need to get that shot, then I'm going to set my shutter to 1,000th of a second and the ISO is whatever it needs to be. Again, that's unrealistic to make a point. For me, I walk in and say to myself, what is this show? What do I need to accomplish? I'm going to start at 400th. I'm already at 2.8. If I need 6,400th of a second, I may 6,400 ISO. I may start there because I'm totally comfortable there, and then I'll lower it to 32 or 16. I usually tend to set my camera when I first walk into any venue, 2.8, 3/20th or 400th of a second, and ISO 32 or 6,400. That's my starting point, and then I adjust from there.
It's
a long time to get to that.
It's an interesting thing because that's sort of a recurring theme when you talk to people who either shoot concerts or, let's say, fight sports. Like I shoot boxing, for example, MMA, things like that, where you usually
I do Muay Thai and kickboxing and stuff too. So.
And again, you have to deal with usually underlit venues and fast movement and not very perfectly lit scenarios. But the one thing that I think most people have in common is that they shoot wide open. Now, for you and me, that means 2.8. But what if somebody has, let's say, a 50 mil 1.4 lens or even a 1.2? Would that make sense to go that far open, or do you run into depth of field issues? Would you say it's a good idea to go that wide, or what's your suggestion on that?
So that to me is a fantastic question. Let me explain why. A lot of people do have a nifty 50 it's 1.8. Do you shoot at 1.8? Well, at that point, it's a very inexpensive lens, and 1.8 is not anywhere even near the sweet spot. But shooting that 1.8 at 2.8, okay, now you're still at 2.8. You got plenty of light. You're going to get a better picture most likely out of it. However, if that band, like happened to me the other night, I'm at 6,400 and I got all the way down at one point to 1/20th of a second, 2.8, 1/20th of a second, 6,400, and consistently, like it wasn't, I don't mind if a shot's dark because then the lights come on and off and on and off. The lights never came on in a way that I could get the shot that I wanted. So I go up to 10,000 or 12,800. That 1.8 is to me a recovery point. If the 2.8 isn't working, and it's like, okay, this isn't working, I'm either going to raise my ISO to 10,000 or 12,800, or I'm going to start by going to 1.8. Okay, you can get more light that way. However, if you're in a photo pit or if you're side of a fight where really to freeze a punch, you need about 6/40th of a second. I mean, you could freeze it lower than that. Yeah. If you're lucky, you time it at impact. So when you're doing a punch, right, there's speed coming out. You freeze at the very end on impact and tighten on impact, and then you immediately recoil. Well, if you freeze it during the connection just right, you're going to get a little bit of blur and you can go slower than that. But to really freeze it, you need about 6/40th of a second. I would not shoot that at 1.8 because, yes, at that point, the depth of field becomes a problem. However, if you have all access, and that doesn't mean you're in a stadium, shooting a A-list artist. If you're shooting in a bar, a pub, and you know the band, and you're able to climb up behind the drummer and get the drummer hands up in the air, sticks in the air from behind, as he's drumming, the depth of field of his body ain't changing that much. So to shoot that at 1.8 can get you some wonderful lights blurred out in the crowd. So the answer to your question is yes and no. it's like any tool, right? There are times that I need a flathead screwdriver, and there's times that I need a Phillips head screwdriver, and they both work for the appropriate time. Using a 1.8 aperture is wonderful for the appropriate time, and it's a disaster using it at the wrong time. That's a creative decision at that point.
Hey, let me just jump in real quick to tell you about the amazing sponsor of this episode, Platypod. Platypod offers innovative camera support systems designed to unleash your creativity. With their stable, versatile, and portable solutions, you can capture stunning shots like never before. And I'm not just saying that. As the host of the Camera Shake podcast, I can personally vouch for Platypod's incredible products. They've become an integral part of the show. In fact, I'm surrounded by various Platypod products holding up lights, cameras, microphones, and so on. It's really helped to transform the way I make the show and the way I shoot at home, in the studio, and on location. But don't just take my word for it. Explore Platypod's website at www.platypod.com to discover their range of products, including the Platypod Extreme, Platypod tripod heads, and the brand new handle, of course. Make sure to follow Platypod on Instagram and Facebook at Platypod Tripods for exclusive updates, tips, and giveaways. By choosing Platypod, you're not only investing in your photography, but you're also supporting the Camera Shake Photography Podcast. Thanks again to Platypod, our amazing sponsor. Platypod, where innovation never sleeps. All right, super quick timeout. If you're enjoying Camera Shake and fancy supporting the show, we've got Camera Shake merch available right now. Grab a hoodie, a tee, or a mug. Look good doing it and help us keep the lights on. Links in the description. Now back to the good stuff. You know, the one thing I've started doing, which with great effect actually, especially when I shoot boxing, is that I started using auto ISO, and it seems to work really quite well. So the way I approach it basically is, similar sort of thing. My aperture is wide open, which is 2.8. I know that the first thing I'm trying to figure out, really at the very, very beginning, is what my maximum shutter speed can be under those conditions.
Right, exact same as me.
Yeah. So if I want to freeze, if I, in terms of boxing, if I want to freeze a punch, it really, I need to be at 800, 640, 800, something like that, realistically. So, and in order to do, and there are some venues where that's just not possible. I mean, sometimes some places are just lit to the point. In the worst case scenario, it's 320, which for boxing is really not enough. You get a lot of motion blur, but if that's what you got to go with, that's what you got to go with. It's better than having no pictures. But typically, I would live around the 500 mark. Ideally, that's a good compromise. And then if I can go to 640, 800, beautiful.
And I apologize, but I do want to inject here. I apologize for interrupting you, but this is key. Yeah, you might need 640th or 800th or whatever, and you can do it at 500. The key is, again, what is it you're shooting for? So if you're shooting for, I'm going to make something up, you're shooting for a fight website. So in other words, it's editorial. Okay.
Right. Yeah.
Or you're shooting for the promotion, whatever. Your deliverables aren't going to be all of your photos.
Yes. Correct.
So if shooting at 500, you're going to miss some shots because you just can't freeze it. The odds are at 500, you're going to get enough shots to meet your deliverable requirement. And I think that's one of the areas that a lot of new photographers don't think about. No, you don't have to have every shot be perfect. You have to get enough to meet your deliverables requirement.
And that's an interesting point, because that's actually exactly what the problem is, in a sense. So when I started using auto ISO, and basically the way auto ISO works, for those of you listening or watching who don't know, you can basically let the camera make the decision as to how high or low it wants to set the ISO, but you can also set limits. So you can set an upper limit, you can set a lower limit. So for instance, if you want to say like, all right, on my camera, I don't want to go past 6400 because I know everything beyond that's going to look too grainy or too noisy or whatever, then you can set that limit there. Or, if you have a more recent camera, like a Z8, you can easily set it to 10,000 and still, be happy with it. But whatever that limit is. So I basically set a limit, and And usually what it will do is it will stay within that limit. So, and then when I import and here's where the downside is of this. Let's say, for argument's sake, especially on the Z8, especially with Nikon's latest, 24-70 2.8 lens, which is a killer lens. Let's say I shoot 2,000 images. Let's just say, for argument's sake, I'll guarantee you that 1,985 of those are tack sharp. And that's a problem, because all of a sudden your theoretical deliverables could be nearly 2,000 images. And that's way,
Except it's not, because you're still doing low light action photography, and you're doing sports or music, you're doing action, right? So while they're all sharp, and in fights, they may all be lit okay, right? It's still based on the moment.
Oh,
so
greatly.
If you're shooting a burst of 5 shots and that punch is coming in, you want this, right? But you're a Nikon shooter. And that's a key distinction in what you just said, where you said that you're using auto ISO and it's going to, do your adjustment for you, and you can set an upper range and you can set a lower range because, you know that you don't want to go above 6,400, and that may be the case, right? Only you can decide, you in the figurative sense, only you can decide what's too noisy for you. However, I've been preaching this for probably 15 years. Stop worrying about the freaking noise. Ignore the noise. I literally, my mantra is ignore the noise in 2 ways. Ignore the noise in your camera. No one can freaking see it. You're zooming in Lightroom or Capture One or Camera Raw or Photoshop to 100%, and no one is doing that. You're sharing them on Instagram, for God's sake. Ignore the noise. No one. When you compress the image, it's going to get soft. It's going to probably look like crap on the WordPress blog anyway because of a compression software. I hate my radio station's WordPress setup because it compresses my images to death. When you shrink it down in resolution, you're throwing away half the pixels, and half of those pixels are noise. Like, just stop. And by the way, expose it properly. You're just as well, people try and keep the ISO down because they're worried about the noise, but then they underexpose it. And then when they boost it, you've got noise in skin and in the shadows, and you shouldn't. If you had exposed it properly for their skin, you'd probably have slightly less noticeable noise in their skin, and the noise is mostly going to be prevalent in the shadows. So you're actually doing yourself some harm by underexposing because you don't want to raise your ISO. Just raise the ISO. But the other thing is, you referenced a Z8, or for the Canadian friends, a Z8. Nikon is unique. So I don't like auto ISO. One, because I want everything to stay static. I'm not shooting fights as much where the lighting is bad, but it doesn't change that drastically. I'm shooting concerts where lights are literally on, then off, red, then blue, right? Auto ISO would be fine if I could use spot metering. I don't use a center focus point almost ever.
Right.
I move my focus point. I compose in my brain in rule of thirds and things like that, and I put my focus point where I want it, or I use face detection and frame it where, face and eye detection, frame it where I want it. That does me no good if that face or my focus point, whatever it's on, is up and off to a side, because on a Canon, unless you're on a 1 series, if you're in spot metering, it's always spot metering in the center.
Oh.
Okay.
Okay.
Only a 1 series does spot metering follow your focus point. On the 5 series, meaning an R5, an R5 Mark II, an R6, an R6 Mark III, whatever it is, it's spot meters off the center point always. So if I have a dark stage and I position the face on a rule of third up into the right-hand side in my viewfinder, and that face is lit up, my spot metering is metering off a pure black background. And my auto ISO is useless to me. So now I have to use matrix metering, which is taking in an entire scene, which doesn't do me any good because most of my scene is pure black. And then I have a face that's so bright that it will clip. So now I'm in a scenario where auto ISO, I then have to use exposure compensation and underexpose by a stop or sometimes even 2 stops. For me, it's easier to lock my ISO on and do everything with the shutter speed and just give myself an ISO that gives me the shutter speed latitude that I need. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. I mean, this is something I've heard that before about Canon. I've completely forgotten it. It's because on a Nikon, you're so used to wherever your focus point is, that's where it's doing the spot metering, which is beautiful, especially when it comes to like the Z8, the Z9. The autofocus is so good, especially in fast fight sport situations. Even it just locks on. It virtually almost hardly ever misses at all. And you can rely on the metering.
I've asked Canon, by the way, I've asked Canon why they do that. And the response is usually, well, it just doesn't really matter that much anymore. The meters on cameras are so good. And it's like, yeah, but in extreme scenarios, spot metering is amazing.
Yeah.
If you're using the center focus point, or if you're on a Nikon, you can do I shouldn't say any Nikon. The pro bodies like a Z9 and then the prosumer bodies all have a spot meter that follows the focus point, which I would kill for.
And even in a really relatively old, like what is it, 12, 13, 15-year-old D750, for example, does that, which is a fantastic camera to first get into that. So if you're a Nikon shooter, you are lucky in that respect. But to me, so what I've noticed is in boxing in particular. So here's the thing: in a typical boxing scenario, you usually have 2 main lights that light the ring, and they usually nowadays they're LED lights, but they're basically on adjacent, opposite corners of the ring. So you've got one light on one corner, another light on the other corner. So as a photographer, if you have access, so when I shoot boxing, I have all access. I can be on top of the ring. I can literally almost lean into the ring if I want to. I can be off the ring. I can, shoot up. I could do whatever I want. But what I've learned,
the way standing on the corner of a boxing ring, photographing fight sports is one of the most exhilarating things that you'll ever do.
It's wild. It's wild, especially when they come at you. I've had numerous occasions where I've literally had the lens pushed into my face. It's just what happens. And sometimes you can sometimes I have to grab hold of one of the the cables on the side, and even let myself lean out so I get out of the way, but I could get some awesome shots that way. But what I've learned is in terms of positioning myself relative to the light is if I am literally underneath a light, I get the best shots. The athletes are lit the best. It's, the light doesn't change depending on how they're positioned. If I'm on the other side, like the other corner where there's no light, I immediately have a problem. And so the one thing I've learned is, through experience, I've been doing this for, I don't know, six years or something. I've just learned that my physical position in relation to the lights matters just as much as having the right camera settings, in a sense, in order to give me the shots. Because if you think about it, like for instance, take a typical over-the-shoulder shot, right? So you want to get, somebody punching, and you want to shoot over the shoulder of the opponent so you can see the attacker's, face and the facial expression, and possibly have even part of the glove in the foreground, sort of thing. If you want to get that over-the-shoulder shot, you need to make sure that face is lit. And the only way that it's going to lit properly is when the light is directly hitting that face over the shoulder of the opponent. And so you need to be in the right place for that. Otherwise, all you're going to get is half a face in complete shadow because they're just sideways to the light, and it just doesn't work.
See, so a lot of the times that I have photographed Muay Thai or kickboxing or something like that, they're either large events like K1 or Glory, K1 being, worldwide, or it's more of a local promoter, but it is televised. So one of the some of the people that I train with in karate, they fight Muay Thai, and they fight for a particular promotion that gets aired in the States, or at least in California, on Fox Sports. So the lighting is different.
Sure.
They will usually have 4 truss. You have the 4 posts, and then you have ropes in between. They'll have a truss over each side of the ring with 4 or 5 lights on it. Yeah. So you have the added thing of, depending on where the fighters are in the ring, you are radically backlit. And it's not just that they're backlit. If they're in a venue where the ceiling isn't high, the lights are actually right behind their head, and there's like 5 of them super bright. The other fun thing about fight sports to me, though, is unrelated to lighting. I always like to see both fighters, but inevitably that's very difficult when you have 2 subjects in any frame and one of them is punching the other one. If you're capturing one person, they're facing each other. So if you're capturing one person's face, the odds are you're capturing the person closest to you, you're capturing their butt and whatever promotion text is on their shorts. And that, to me, again, talking about low light, but in this case, a different kind of challenge is I always try and love it when I can get a side shot where they're positioned in such a way that you can see both their faces.
Yeah.
All of this is just challenging. It's not impossible. It's challenging. And I would argue that challenges make you a better photographer. It's the reason I think every photographer should try and shoot, in my case, music. If you're a wedding photographer and you've never gone into a bar and tried to photograph a band performing, and I mean, again, I don't want you to go photograph a singer-songwriter sitting on a stool and go, okay, I did it. No, go photograph a band where the lighting is going nuts and the person's jumping in the air and swinging their hair in a dark bar. You'll learn a ton about yourself and about your photography.
What do you think are the most common lighting traps that photographers fall into, especially in low light situations?
I think one of them is forgetting what they're there for. So people tend to just think it's too dark, I need to make it brighter. Make it brighter. And I shouldn't say we are. We should be, in my opinion, storytellers. And I always have trouble kind of using that word because, look, there are photographs that you're going to look at that everybody will recognize as a great shot. And you're like, I don't understand how that's storytelling, right? But in essence, we are storytellers. The biggest trap people fall into in lighting is forgetting that it's kind of like an old IT thing where we used to say, getting data into a database is easy, right? You create fields, you store them. The key is when you design the database, how are multiple tables connected? What are your key fields? Because the database isn't intended for you to just put data in and store it. The whole point of a database is, how are you going to get the data out? How are you going to present it to somebody? The data does you no good. You fill out a spreadsheet, it does you no good if you can't look at the numbers and have those numbers come back out to somebody. And that's photography, right? Just capturing a shot that's sharp, just capturing a shot that's exposed, that isn't it. If you forget, what am I trying to really accomplish here? Meaning, and this would be a great conversation, by the way, for our mutual friend Kevin. What is the viewer supposed to take away from this? Like, I'm not going to be standing there next to the viewer of my photo when I post it on Instagram or wherever it is and be able to say to him, so it was all backlit and then it was red and then it went blue and then he jumped in the air, but he jumped in the air facing away from me and then the smoke was covered. I'm not going to be able to do that, right? They have to look at a photo, that viewer, and interpret it for themselves. It may not be the story I intended. What do I want the viewer to be able to take away with no words from me? That's how you decide your lighting. And I mean it even for lighting that's difficult. I mean, that applies if you're doing a portrait, right? Are you doing an environmental portrait? Are you doing a headshot? Are you lighting it dramatic? Are you lighting it hard edge? Are you lighting it soft? Are you doing Rembrandt lighting? Are you doing butterfly? Like, there's a lot of choices when you're doing studio stuff. But even in a concert, I have to decide as I'm looking through my viewfinder, this person is standing at the front edge of the stage and it's pure black behind them, but there's a light up in that way up there. And it's making this perfect cone-shaped beam of light coming down on them. Okay. Do I just take a tight shot of them while they're there? Because the odds are 2 seconds from now, they're running to the other side of the stage. Or do I take the whole light in? Neither one's wrong. But they both revolve around your question of what's the biggest traps people fall into. And that is he's in front of me. He's lit. Shoot it. Oh, he's lit and he's sharp. Okay, so is every other photographer's shot at that moment.
So when the lighting gets chaotic, and you have to make some decisions, like in your mind, what's the number one priority? Is it the moment, or is it the composition, or is it the exposure?
Oh, wow. Okay. For me, because I shoot action in music, right? It's always the moment. Like, the moment is everything to me. Can I photograph a moment where my subject is blurry or soft? Yes. If you still get the idea. And sometimes if the blur, in other words, let me reword that, not blurry. Can I photograph a moment and have the picture not be technically excellent? Yes. Will it hurt my soul? Yes. 100%.
Every time.
But can it work? And I'm in this example, I'm saying that the blur is not intentional, let's say, because you can also do this intentionally, right? You can blur drumsticks. You can have crazy blur to throw that motion into your story. Let's assume you didn't want the motion. You didn't want the blur. There's two ways there can be blur. I screwed up. I missed focus. That is completely different than I was shooting at a 60th of a second as somebody was running. That's motion blur. Totally different. When I'm photographing somebody, it all comes down to, no matter what the genre, it all comes down to choices that you make. And I can take a picture that I intend to be sharp, I intend to be technically excellent, I intend to have taken at the right moment, and I can miss on any of the three that I just mentioned. However, if I got the moment, the picture may still be usable. If it's motion blur, that can be part of the story if it's enough motion blur to look intentional. If it's just he's out of focus because I wasn't a fast enough shutter, probably not, right? But the moment matters. Composition probably would be second to me. Composition, I don't think gets enough attention. I think today, a lot of photographers that shoot, again, not talking studio stuff, music, fights, whatever, if the subject's in the middle, the subject is lit right, and the subject is sharp, they're happy and they'll post it. And I would argue, okay, whatever, cool. There's 17 other photographers standing around the same boxing ring as you. They got those, right? You have to decide where the importance is to you. But for me, it would be composition right after moment, because that tells the story. I don't care if you do it in post, by the way. Crop it in post. I don't care. What was the third one?
Exposure.
Exposure, I don't really give a damn about. I mean, I do. Don't misunderstand me. But in the scheme of things, I've had shots where I shot a band one time, metal band. There was zero front lighting in a dark, the venue was so dark that kids were sitting on the floor and I tripped over them twice. I literally couldn't see them when they were in front of me. So dark the venue was. No lighting in front, only lighting from truss that was flowing behind the singer, kind of over the drummer. And so here's a good example. You have to decide, how am I going to convey this to the viewer? I'm not going to pop a flash in the singer's face. One, I wouldn't have been allowed to there. Two, I'm going to blind him, right? Because this room's so dark, his eyes will be gone. But I wouldn't anyway. But the drummer was lit. So this lead singer kept coming out with this kind of metal with his hands at his side and his feet apart. And I'm down below in the photo pit. He's up on a stage. I positioned the drummer between his legs. Drummer's lit up behind him. And he's this like monster silhouette, which conveys that, metal music. It's all choices, but that composition combined with the fact that that was a moment of the singer doing something physically, and yet there really was no lighting on it.
Yeah, when I think of like tricky, especially low light situation, I always think like, there's basically two almost different types of situations. There's the one situation where the lighting is difficult, but it's consistent, and then you have those situations where the lighting keeps changing and it's chaotic, like a concert or a gig, for example, where you have moving lights and everything keeps changing all the time. In a situation like this, when it's really chaotic, it's a lot to handle. You've got to handle your camera settings. You got to, figure out your angles. You got to figure out where you're going to hit the shutter, like, what's happening on stage, because everything's always changing. Do you rely on, what I'm trying to say is it instinct that takes over at that point? Because I imagine it's really difficult to make those decisions under those chaotic circumstances. Is it just like intuition and instinct that takes over at that moment?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's some intuition and instinct that comes through in everything, right? If you're in the studio shooting a portrait, there's certain points where that kicks in. I think experience is probably the key driver, though. Now, call that intuition or whatever you want, but I'd use the word experience, and here's why. If you're going to photograph low light action photography, especially in a changing low light action photography like a concert, you have to just know your gear. Like there is no substitute for, I know how to use my camera. And the reason that matters so much is, I remember there's a tour that used to happen here, used to be long. Now they've done a couple of shows a year. They just came back, Warp Tour. And I remember the old Warp Tour, we'd go, and it was one of the rare times where I could get 2 photo passes because there were 70 bands and whatever, 7 stages. And I would take a very good, Troy, friend of mine is a wedding photographer, Troy Miller. And there are very few photographers as knowledgeable as Troy. Like the dude knows his stuff. And I remember the first time we walked out of a photo pit, and it's like 2:00 in the afternoon, 1:00 in the afternoon, bright sun. And this guy knows his gear. He knows what he's doing. He walked out of that photo pit so frustrated, it was hilarious to me. He's like, I got him. And by the time I got him in focus and set my exposure, he was gone. Like he was there and then he was gone. It's like, well, yes. And it's the same thing with changing dark light or colored lights. You have to be able, when that bass player comes up and points the bass head right at you for literally 2 seconds, smiles at you to get a shot. And of course, you've got 2 bodies, and the one body that you had was the body that has a 70 to 200 on it, and that was up in your hand as he walked towards you, right? You've got to very quickly drop the 70 to 200, pick up the second body that has the 15 on it, pull it up, get focus, get the shot before he's gone. And I'm not kidding. He's gone in less than 5 seconds. And he may come up to you, and now he's at the edge of the stage where the lighting isn't hitting. And now your camera was set for when you were shooting the whole band and the whole stage was lit up because it's a 15 millimeter. Now you got to shoot him up close and you got to adjust the exposure. So experience, I tell people, you better know your gear. You better know your reciprocals. I know for a fact, often what I will do at a show, and the best example for this is an outdoor show, and it works for fights too, by the way. Outdoor show at a music festival. Lead singer is going to walk out to the edge of the stage. Bright sunlight. Stage is covered, but bright sunlight. The drummer could be 3 or 4 stops darker. So I will meter zoomed in on the drum set. What's my exposure? Then there'll be stage monitors in the bright sun at the very front edge of the stage. I'll meter the stage monitors that are just blaring hot. You can't touch them. Okay, that is a 3-stop difference. I shoot in a third of a stop. That's 12 clicks. So if the singer steps back into the shade and then steps out into the sun, I know what I need to do. And it's the same for indoors. When that bass player comes up in your face, I will meter what I need at the front of the stage, and I'll meter when they're under the spotlight. And let's say that it's a 2-stop difference. I know, oh my God, here he comes. 6 clicks. Click, 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 click. Boom, I'm ready to go. You have to know your gear without thought.
Yeah, I mean that's one of those things. It's just, you can't get around practicing, and I always say to people, like, if you want to get good at shooting gigs, you can do a lot worse than actually just go and just see some bands and photograph the gigs, because you can theorize as much as you want about it until you're actually there in that situation. You realize that everything.
If you can shoot in a nightclub,
yeah.
If you can shoot in a bar, a dark, dingy bar, where there's a bunch of microphone stands coming out of people's heads, and you can make something that doesn't look like there's microphone stands coming out of people's heads, you can. Trust me, everybody wants to get to the difficult shows in the arenas. No, it's the other way around.
Oh,
right?
yeah.
You photograph Kiss in an arena, you're going to be shooting at 400 ISO, 800 ISO. Lighting is perfect. Everything's perfect. Yeah, please go shoot in a bar. That's how you break your chops.
Yeah, a lot of the times when you shoot a band in a small pub, for instance, over here in the UK, I always think you walk in and for some reason the band thinks it's a really good idea to put a blue LED on one side and a red LED on the other side of the stage, and you get no natural, no white light at all, and you just go, "What this? Is it good or terrible?" No matter what you do. At that point, I usually go into shooting black and white. It's like the easy way out at that point.
Well, and that's an interesting one. So that ties right into what we're talking about with difficult lighting. In particular with concerts where you have colored light, there are so your camera's capturing RGB. You're having lights, usually LEDs now, that may have so LEDs are not technically constant. They kind of have a refresh cycle, just like your electrical grid does. It's 50 hertz in everywhere, pretty much. And then North America, it's 60 hertz. If that light is an inexpensive light or has a refresh cycle that doesn't match your lighting, if you shoot at 200th of a second, you're going to get weird banding in your lights. And now you may have to shoot at 60th or 100, a divisible of 60. And even then, at a point, you're going to get banding, right? You have to make choices understanding RGB. So that's why I tend to keep an RGB meter on my camera on instead of just a luminance meter. Because the skin, if you're going to clip a color, I don't want to clip their face. I don't want their face being clipped beyond repair. And I can clip the blue. I can clip the green. If I clip the red, their face is gone most likely, and I will never get it back. However, if you're looking at a color picture and somebody's face is blown out, as long as you haven't clipped the red channel, you can most likely convert that to black and white, and all the detail is there. The detail is in all the channels. As long as you got one of them that's not clipped, you can usually convert to black and white. I've got a shot of Rob Zombie, and he was pure red. And his face literally looks like this smooth red paint. There's no detail. Now, he has black stripes on his face and his veins on the back of his hand. His hand was just a blob of red. Converted it to black and white, and you can see the veins and the paint and everything. Understanding mixes of colors and RGB and not blowing out all three of them can make it to where you can convert to black and white to save a shot.
Yeah. The first time I ran into that issue with very extreme banding, and when I say extreme banding, it's basically half the frame would be black, on every other shot. I remember I was shooting a boxing.
And sometimes
event.
It's not half the frame. You'll have a bright line, a dark line, a bright line. It looks literally like a zebra.
Yeah. And sometimes it's just half the complete frame gone. At first I thought like, oh shoot, my shutter mechanism is screwed or something. I couldn't really understand what was happening, and it took me a little while to realize that what had happened in this particular event is that the lighting company didn't show, right, and so they had to get as an emergency. They had to get a local small company, and then they basically set up these really inexpensive, shall I say, cheap, LED lights. That were really not fit for this purpose. And of course, I'd never experienced that before, so I was like, it took me a minute to figure out what was going on until it dawned on me that actually it's the cycle speed, of these LEDs that, and at that point in my situation, then I just had to live with the fact that every other shot was going to be garbage, and you then kind of just get over that. And, as long as you have the important shots. But I tell you what, there's just one thing I just remembered I wanted to mention earlier when we were talking about high ISO settings. The one thing I have to say when it comes to like shooting really high ISO, so the higher you crank your ISO, the more of a problem you're going to have with like blotchy colors, right? And that's kind of the reason why I try to keep the ISO as low as I can possibly keep it. Although I know noise is not necessarily much of a problem, on the Z8 is actually very good when it comes to like low light situations. You can crank the ISO up, and the noise levels are quite low. And also, of course, there's a lot you can do in post in order to denoise things and stuff. So noise isn't really that much of an issue. Color though is, and what I find is, when I shoot at 10,000 or 12,000 ISO, it really has an impact on the blotchiness of the colors, and I just don't like it as much anymore. And at that point, I always think like, I keep that in check a little bit.
Yeah. So when you people don't realize this, at least I don't think a lot of people realize this. When you raise your ISO, your camera loses dynamic range.
Yeah.
So when you see that a camera, so your eye, whatever it is, I forget the number. It's like 23, 24 stops of light or something like that. And it can be higher, it can be lower, because your eye adjusts to light so quickly that if something's really bright, you'll see it. And if something's really dark, you tend to see it. Camera can't do that. So, it used to be when I started, cameras were lucky to get 12, 13 stops. And that's why, you had to choose in a very dynamic scenario. Photography is the art of compromise. Am I willing to blow out the highlights, or am I willing to blow out the shadows? And if I have to blow out both in a concert, because spotlights are going to be blown out and there's going to be pure dark areas on the stage, the way I always describe it is take a gradient from pure black to pure white, right? That's your range. Put a red box in the middle of that gradient. That's your camera, right? And then slide that red box and decide which area do you want. Well, that's all fine nowadays when you have a camera that gets 15, 16 stops, okay? Still not as much as your eye, but you're getting more stops. until you go to ISO 200, and then ISO 400, and then ISO 3200. And now you're not getting those 15 stops of light. You'll be lucky if you're getting 11. So yes, you're right. It is important to understand what you're photographing. However, again, it's that dictation thing. I dictate to my phone so much. I always want to say, however, comma, you still have to decide what's important to you. Like I have a saying, a noisy, sharp shot is almost always better. I'm using the word almost, although I don't totally believe it, but almost always better than a clean, blurry shot. So if the difference in me getting a sharp shot so that my shutter is fast enough is me shooting at 12,800 ISO, I'm going to do it because it's going to get me the shutter that I need. And even though it's noisy, a sharp, noisy shot is better than if I shot that same thing at too slow of a shutter speed and I had no noise, but the shot is just useless. Right?
Yeah. I had an interesting conversation with Jerry Guiones actually at Imaging. We were talking about wedding photography. And, I said to him, like, okay, what kind of tips would you have for somebody like me who isn't necessarily that experienced shooting weddings and stuff? And he goes like, the number one tip I can give you is, make sure you plan ahead of time so you get the shot. Because, even if you have a shitty photo of Uncle Bob, that's still a million times better than not having a photo of Uncle Bob at all. And that's sort of, it makes you think, because of course initially when I asked that question, I was thinking, what lens choices do I have to consider, blah, 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 and really it's got nothing to do with that. It's basically like, just make sure you plan your way out of trouble. That's the thing. Because, if you're doing the group shots at a wedding and you forget somebody and then the couple go, do you have a picture of Uncle Bob and Aunt Henrietta?
My high school friend was there that I hadn't seen in 30 years. Where's the photo?
Yeah, exactly right. That's exactly the thing. There was also, I tell you what, there was another experience I had some years ago. I went to Amsterdam. All right. And in Amsterdam, interestingly enough, every other building is a museum, right? And I think they used the word museum instead of shop, right? So there's a cheese museum, for example, and it was really a cheese shop. Very interesting, lots of different cheeses, but you could buy a lot. I mean, Anyway, so I went
in Amsterdam. Coffee shops aren't what you think either.
Well, exactly. Yeah, nothing is what you think it is.
Yeah.
But so I went into a photo museum. It was actually it was a concert photography museum, right? And really what it was a gallery, right? And you could buy prints. But nevertheless, very interesting. And the shots that were really cool was like really, classic black and white concert photography. We're talking like Beatles, Stones, all the way from the 50s, like Elvis, all the way through to the 60s and 70s. Really classic shots, like the classic shots that everybody knows of, whatever, the Beatles at Abbey Road or or whatever. And it was interesting because I was looking at those images and I'm thinking, wow, they are grainy as heck. Sometimes they're over or underexposed, right? It's some there's usually something off with pretty much every single one of those shots, and yet every single one of those shots is iconic.
Yeah, nobody ever looks at a classic Jim Marshall shot, Jimi Hendrix, the Rolling Stones, any of the Beatles shots, Muhammad Ali standing over Sonny Liston. Nobody ever looks at those and goes, there's so much noise. Now, granted, noise in film was different than the grain that we get today, but Rick Salmon used to say, if somebody comments on the noise in your photo and that's the first thing that they notice, there's probably something else wrong with your photo.
Yeah, you probably have a bigger problem than that. That's absolutely true. When you shoot a concert, like how much difference does knowing the music make to, like, does that influence what you sort of anticipate in terms of light?
That took a twist at the end I didn't expect.
Yeah, I mean,
In terms
in terms of the lighting,
Go ahead.
I mean, because the reason I'm asking is because I remember at the beginning you said, you do a lot of research into the band, and so you sort of almost know what to expect, which actually has never really occurred to me. But it's this makes perfect sense. It's completely logical. Yeah, why not?
So let me give you an example. The answer to your question is, yes, if knowing the band, you don't have to know the catalog of music, but knowing who the band is, what they are, what type of music they play, plays a role in expecting, okay, this is a dark, broody metal band. They're going to be all red, right? The whole stage is going to be red the whole night. Dark, dingy. So yes, it'll help you understand who the band is, what it's going to be like, et cetera, et cetera. But specifically in music photography, research matters on levels people don't think about. I'll give you an example. You got a band, they tour in 2025. Stadium band, let's say, big band. When they tour in 2026, almost every time, they will change their stage setup, change their lighting, change what's behind them. They may have pyro on this tour and they didn't on the last tour, right? You knowing that there's going to be pyro on, so we only get to shoot 3 songs usually. Interesting, the Nothing More show, we got to shoot the whole show, 3 from the pit, and then we could go anywhere in the venue and shoot the rest of the set. Knowing that at the end of the Nothing More show, they climb out into the audience on the barricade, the 3 frontline members, the drummer stays by the drum set, and play there. Knowing that there's going to be confetti on the first song. Knowing that there's going to be pyro on song number 3 and that the drummer is going to spin around, right? Researching videos and photos from that specific tour gives you a heads up that if you've got one body and you've got a 70 to 200 on for song number 2, and there's going to be fire on song number 3, and you know there's going to be pyro, get the 70 to 200 off and put your widest lens on, 15 to 35, 24 to 70, whatever it is, so that you can get that shot of the stage with the fire going off, right? That you might, if you got 2 bodies, you might have a 24 to 70 on one and have your 15 to 35 on the other, and have the other one 3 stops underexposed because you know there's going to be fire. And so you're shooting with the 24 to 70, and when the fire starts going off, you pick up the 15 that's already underexposed to compensate for how bright the fire is. So that's one part of the research. But here's, to me, the bigger part. If you ever watch singing competitions, in the States, we have, American Idol, The Voice. You've got equivalents, obviously, in Britain's Got Talent, America's Got Talent, all those. When you watch inexperienced vocalists, I'll use as the example, you'll watch people new to American Idol singing. They'll switch hands constantly. Professional singers don't tend to do that. Doesn't mean they won't. I mean, yes, there will be times the mic will be in the left or the right hand, but they tend to have a dominant hand, right? And so if you have a singer who sings with their right hand and they happen to hold the microphone not an inch from their face, but all the way up against the middle of their mouth. Okay, now if you shoot them straight on, you have what's called mic nose. Even if they hold it off to the side, now you have, and for those watching video, we'll see this. If you're listening on audio, go look at the video for the visual here. But if they're singing with their microphone right hand off a little bit to the right side of their face at a 45-degree angle coming from their mouth, okay, if you know that 90% of the time that's the scenario, which side do you want to photograph them from? Right? If you are on their right, you're shooting the back of their hand that's probably blocking their mouth. If you are shooting on their left side, you're being able to see their fingers move, holding the microphone. You're getting a bigger chunk of their mouth. The other example is guitarists. If you're watching a Joe Bonamassa or somebody that sings while they have a guitar in their hand, guitarists have a tendency to not pull when they hit a big note, to pull straight back from the microphone to hit a big note. They tend to turn and pull back. So the question is, do they turn towards the head of the guitar, thereby facing the face of the guitar to that side of the stage? That's a better shot. Or do they turn the other way? Now it's going behind the mic stand. Or sometimes they turn their head a different way. So they turn the guitar to their left as they turn their head to the right. Now you got to decide. Do you want the face of the guitar and be able to see the guitar and be able to tag Fender on Instagram or Gibson and get the side of their face? Or do you want their face head on and you don't care as much about the guitar? A little bit of research goes a very long way in photographing a musician.
I think that always used to be my advantage when I first started shooting bands in the very, very beginning. Was the fact that, I had about 20, 25 years experience of performing on stage. And the thing for me, the thing that made it relatively easy for me is, one thing I've learned is that, there's like different personas, on stage. Like take guitarists as an example, right? Some guitarists will be locked in the same spot for basically the whole show. Some guitarists will move around a little bit, and then other guitarists who, they're like, you just can't pin them down. They're all over the place. Like Eddie Van Halen would be a good example. Like he'd be all over the shop the whole time. He'd be at the back, the front, the left, the right. He'd be running around. But then the other guitarists who basically stay in the same spot. And so the same thing is true for lead singers. The same thing is true for bass players. And to me, whenever I shoot a concert, I sort of try to get a gist of what each musician is like in general. And that informs a lot of the decisions I make later on and how I'm going to shoot them, because I can almost anticipate what they're going to do. In the guitar solo, for example, some guitarists will just stay in the same spot and play the solo. Some guitarists, like Slash, will move forward and maybe make use of one of the stage monitors or whatever. It just really depends. Some guitarists will move in the center of the stage. Some will just stay where they are. Some are very animated. Some are very static. It just, but once you figured out what kind of persona that particular musician is, it just makes all of your decisions so much easier. In my experience, that's kind of worked for me.
Yeah. Like I'll give you an example. The show I shot the other night, the first band, no names being mentioned. I'm thinking to myself, you're opening for a band that is so insanely fun and dynamic. 4 bands, and you're band number 1. Now, I always tell people, especially photographers, but I even tell audience members, stop going just for the top 2 headliners. Go see every band. That first of 4 bands is hungry. They want to be the headliner. You're going to get a great photo, right? They're going to give 110%. The headliner is going to give 90%. Right? But the other night, last Wednesday, wasn't the case. The singer was just kind of stood there, was kind of boring, sounded fantastic, was just kind of boring. No stage presence really, I would argue, whatsoever. The guitarist was insane. And that always makes me think of a very famous band, Stained. So the band Stained, Aaron Lewis, the vocalist, tends to just stand at the microphone and sing. And I remember the first time I photographed them thinking, I think the guitarist thinks he's in a different band. Because I think he thinks that he's in Metallica. And Aaron Lewis is standing at the microphone with a baseball hat on, singing, what is effectively a rock ballad. And this guy is spinning and doing all kinds of crazy stuff. The other example, when you say some people stand there, for some bands, it doesn't matter. But when you're shooting Judas Priest, huge stage, the bass player stands pretty much in one spot, way back right in front of his bass amps near the drummer. You're not going to shoot him without a 70-200. He's way too far away. When I shot Motorhead, all I really cared about, really, in all honesty, was photographing Lemmy. And Lemmy had stage monitors way back. he stayed behind his stage monitors and sang from back there. Knowing that before walking in look, you can see it when you get there and go, oh, okay, I better use this. Yes, you can. But knowing those things in advance lets you kind of plan that I'm going to get shots of the drummer first. Like, this is my rule. When I walk into a show, some drum sets, think Neil Peart of Rush, right? Some drum sets are such that you can't even see the drummer. Well, you're lucky to get eyes between a rototoms and a cymbal. And then there's a mic stand coming in for them to sing, right? Usually there's one spot for every drummer that gets you the cleanest shot of their face and their hands in the air. I will almost always position myself there to start. I photograph the singer first when they come out from that position. Once I got a couple of safe shots of the singer, I photograph the drummer and then I move. Because I know Lemmy's not going to be there. He's not going to move, right? I know the bass player is going to stand there. So knowing one musician doesn't move affects how you shoot all the other musicians, because you know I can get them on song 3. It doesn't matter. Yeah, research is key.
Yeah, so Angus and Malcolm Young in AC/DC used to be a good example. Angus used to be all over the shop all the time, and Malcolm would basically stand in the same spot for the whole show. And it's a really good example. Now, what lessons from working in low light situations do you think directly apply to things like weddings or events or let's say even street photography, for example?
So this is going to be a weird, I've got a pen in my hand because I'm making notes as you're saying things.
Okay.
Because there's things I want to get to. This is going to be kind of a weird answer. Partially the answer to your question is some things will directly relate. Other things will not directly relate. Doing my own podcast, and I'm curious if this is the case for you. I'm a music photographer. Now, most photographers that I know are like, I live and breathe photography, and if I'm on vacation, I got my camera, and if I'm here, I've got my camera, and if I'm walking down the boulevard in Las Vegas, down the strip, I'm taking pictures of shadows, I have to be shooting. That's just not me. I'm a music photographer. I photograph live music. I like doing behind-the-scenes stuff backstage, but I'm not a landscape photographer. I don't want to be a landscape photographer. I don't want to be a wedding photographer. I've shot one wedding and hated it absolutely. But for my podcast, I intentionally for years kind of avoided music photography because I'm known as a music photographer for whatever amount I'm known. And I didn't want people to think it was a music photography podcast. So I avoided that. And I will tell you, I learned more about music photography from talking to landscape photographers than I ever would have learned from music photographers. Music photographers don't talk about layers. Music photographers don't talk about foreground, midground, background. They tend to photograph it because there's a drummer behind a singer. There's lighting or microphones or another. If you're shooting from the side, you have the singer and then a guitar player far in the distance, less lit, and then lighting up above. But they don't compositionally talk about foreground, midground, background. But once you understand foreground, midground, background, you're no longer accidentally having a guitarist that's slightly less lit behind your singer. Or accidentally is the wrong word, without thought, having a drummer behind the singer. Of course there's a drummer behind the singer. I'm just photographing the singer. The drummer happens to be there. Once you understand foreground, midground, background, you start thinking about this metal singer is purely dark, like literally just shadow. He's a silhouette. In front of my eyes, he's a silhouette. I couldn't get detail in him if I tried, but he keeps spreading his legs and doing the thing I talked about earlier. And, the drummer's lit. Let's get them both in the shot. Where can I put the drummer? Well, I can put him right. you start thinking foreground, midground. And I would argue the same thing in reverse. Other genres can take away from music photography the one thing that we can't get away from, and that is we have such radical dynamic range and movement that we have to make a choice. We can't try and capture all of it. We have to pick one person. We have to pick the right moment with the light, right? It can be a great scream, but there's so much happening behind them that it's useless. Or we can capture the same screen at a moment when all the other lights turned off and one blue light was behind them. Maybe even intersected them and they break the beam of light, right? A wedding is lit. A moment's a moment. But is it? Right? If you're really getting artistic, is it? You can take that idea of really picking and choosing your background, your surroundings. Now, most good wedding photographers do anyway. But again, I think that's intuition and experience. And a lot of times I don't think it's conscious. They don't think about it. It's just what you do because you don't want stuff out of their head. But when you start looking at scenarios like music where there's so much shit behind people and I've got to make that work, I think that every other genre of photography can benefit from understanding turning chaos into simplicity.
And that's the key for just about everything in life. Simplify. If somebody...
Oh, actually, you know what? That's a good word. You'll hear educators talk about this. If you have 5, make it 4. If you have 3, make it 2. What music photography, and to me at least, teaches photography in general, informs the photography space is take something away. Because inevitably there's going to be other stuff. Stages are busy. There's tour photographers and cases and mic stands and lights and cables and monitors and drummers and guitarists and bassists and banners and fans or crew standing on the side. So now you have an amp with just a head above it, right? Try and take something away from the shot. I don't mean physically take it away. I mean remove something. Look at the scene and go, what needs to be removed from this? And I think that can inform wedding or whatever. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, that's exactly it. It's very often it's about actually focusing on the thing that's actually important in a shot. And I think it's a very common mistake. When you kind of you shoot a scene and you think like, oh, I want everything in there, but actually. And very often you learn that lesson when you're actually editing the picture, and you get to the point where you look at the shot and you go, actually, if I crop right in, I'm going to keep what's important and I get rid all of that stuff that means nothing. Like the back of the stage, that's not telling the story. It's maybe
exactly. And you may not see it right away, by the way.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
There's times I'm like, oh man, I want this scene and I want the lights and I want all of it. And I look at it 3 days later after I've posted it and God damn it. There's just too much open space. Like I love white space. I always think to myself, if somebody put this and needed to put, ad copy on it. But sometimes you look at it afterwards and go, if I had just filled the frame just with them.
Yeah, because let's say you take a shot of a singer, like a wide shot, and you've got a lot of the rest of the stage in the shot. But then when you edit it, you go like, wow, that facial expression is unbelievable. Had I only zoomed into the face, because that would have been an amazing shot. And you have to make those decisions sometimes, on the cutting room floor, as they say. But, if somebody were to, try to improve their sort of low light photography, would you say that it's just, the best thing they can do is basically just put themselves into those situations a lot?
Yeah, the funny thing about music photography, so you can practice almost every other genre, right? You can practice wedding photography by just putting somebody in a wedding gown and standing them in a church or in a hall and frame it shallow depth of field and nobody knows that you're not in a church, right? Music photography is a little different. You need a band or a singer or something. You need lighting to really stage it. It's very difficult to just practice music. There are parts you can. Like I used to, when I do workshops, I tell people, I want you to find a friend with long hair. Male, female, doesn't matter. I want you to experiment. Shoot it wide open, 2.8, whatever ISO you need. I want you to experiment with different shutter speeds. I want you to photograph it at 1/10 of a second. I want you to photograph it at 600th of a second and have them bend forward and flip their hair back up like a guitarist banging their head, right, with long hair. And I want you to try and get their eyes to be in focus, even at 1/10 of a second. Now, if you're shooting, I'll go easier. If you're shooting 50th of a second with somebody whipping their head up and down, right, at that point, you're probably going to have to pan with them. Use face and eye, focus, and you're minimizing the distance that they're traveling in relation to your sensor by moving with them. You may be always a little behind them because you go down, they stop, they go back. Oh, you're going back up. You're trailing them, but you're minimizing the speed difference. If your sensor's just sitting there and they're just moving, it's all speed. But if you move with them, it minimizes that speed difference, and you can try, just like panning for a race car or an airplane, right? You can really get a blur in the hair and everything else and try and get eyes tack sharp. Try it as well at a fast shutter speed. Find out for you what you're comfortable with freezing somebody moving like that. Same with a punch or something like that. But beside that, it's very difficult to stage and practice a real concert. But every single city has a nightclub where there's 4 guys that are 17 to 23 that want to be the next Green Day, and they're going down there every night, and they have to sell their own tickets. They're not being paid, but you buy tickets from them to get into the show, and they want you there, and they're going to put on a killer show for you. And call the venue and say, do you mind, call the band. Do you mind if I photograph your show? When they say yes, call the venue. It's private property. Band has said, I'm okay to bring a camera. I just wanted to make sure I'm going to be walking in with a camera. Yeah, okay, no problem. Talk to the band. Can I come on stage? I'll stay out of the way. Always wear black. Like, it drives me nuts when people go on stage wearing a white t-shirt photographing. It is not about you. You should be invisible. The band is on stage. It's about the band. And go practice in a club. Everybody can practice music photography. You just have to do it at a show.
And, if you live in Nashville, then that's easy because it seems like, every bar has multiple bands in them. Steve, it's been an absolute pleasure. Again, as always, when you're on the show, it's highly educational. I've learned a ton. So thank you so much for being the guest on this week's Camera Shake podcast.
Dude, it is, first of all, it's always just a pleasure to see you and say hi. Like, when I get to do this with friends, it's just really special. Secondly, I really respect what you do on your show. So it is an honor for you to even ask me to be here. I appreciate it. And someday we should talk about when you add light to this type of a thing.
All right, folks, that is it for today. Huge thanks to Steve. This was, of course, one of those conversations that really gets you thinking about photography differently. And I know there are lots of takeaways you can apply well beyond concert photography from this one. So before you head off, let me point you to another episode I think you'll really enjoy. Go and check out episode 292, where I spoke to a whole bunch of familiar faces over at Imaging USA in Nashville just a week or two ago. So lots of great insights in that one. Maybe was it last month? I think it was last month. Anyway, if you enjoy what we do here on the Camera Shake podcast, don't forget you can support the show by picking up some Camera Shake merch over at camerashakepodcast.com or by buying us a coffee over at buymeacoffee.com/camerashake. It generally helps keep the lights on and the episodes coming. And for those of you listening to the audio version, did you know that there's a fully fledged video version of this episode over on YouTube? Well, you'll see visual context that really complements the conversation there as well. So just head over to YouTube and search for Camerashake Podcast. It's as easy as that. And if you're already on YouTube, drop us a comment, hit like, ring the bell, and share with a friend. That engagement really does help the show reach photographers all over the world. Again, thank you so much for listening and watching. And a new episode drops every Thursday, so make sure that you're subscribed. Until next time, keep shaking things up in the world of photography. I see you next Thursday.